This is the Crossing Bridges podcast, addressing the topics of leadership, criminal justice, and fatherhood. How can we become better leaders? Where are all the daddies? Why is crime at an all-time high? Here is your host, Bayonle Arashi.
Episode 18 of the Crossing Bridges podcast. Welcome to this exciting edition. I hope it's going to be because I have a very, very special guest today on the podcast. Someone that I think is perfect to discuss the issues that this podcast is established to discuss. Issues that are very, very of concern to our community, to our country at large, especially over the last couple of years. Issue of lack of quality leaders, leaders that calls a spade a spade. Leaders that will see white and will say this is white and not the opposite. Issue of lacks of fathers in homes right now, due to societal pressure, due to high rate of crime, issues of high rate of crime, which is what Crossing Bridges podcast is established to discuss. Welcome to this episode of the show. My name is Bayonle Arashi. It's always my pleasure bringing the podcast to you every week on any of the platform you are watching, on YouTube, and on all podcast streaming platform, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google, Apple Podcasts, wherever you are catching it on. Welcome again, and I'm very excited to this on this episode of the podcast. Before I say, because of my excitement, I don't want to say too much. Let me introduce my guest and let us get into the discussion today. And I'm sure you're going to learn. So if you are watching with members of family, please call them, let them listen. Or also, if they're not with you, do not hesitate to share this episode with your loved ones. Let them learn. Let them also seek some of the advice on how they can make their life better, on how we can have more quality men in the society today. It is my pleasure to welcome our Father Alex Andujar. Father, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Before we go deep into the conversation, can you please introduce yourself? Tell us about your background, because I always say the family structure is what most of the time defines a man. So please go ahead and introduce yourself, sir.
Well, my name's Father Alexander Andujar. I'm an Episcopal priest serving in St. Petersburg, Florida. So that's Southwest Florida. It's a wonderful sunny place, even though it gets a little hot here. I am married, been married for 18 years to a wonderful woman. I have two boys who are 16 and 14, so I'm living the teenage years life. I was very fortunate to grow up in a home with a mom and a dad. That doesn't mean it was perfect, doesn't mean it was easy, but it was stable. And I have one older brother who's 7 years older than me, and he's also served as kind of like another father figure. But one of the things I've been able to do throughout my youth and becoming an adult, and even now in my professional life, I always try to identify men who are mentors and men who are smarter than me, have had more life experience than me, so that I can learn from them. And I'm really excited to talk today about these issues that you've brought to my attention and that I've been studying as well.
Excellent. And I mean, you just hit the nail on the head right there. You said you have a lot of things around you while you were growing up that really helped to shape your life, because I figured, and I'm always very happy to share this, coming from an immigrant background. I was also very fortunate to grow up with my mom and my dad, even though my dad in the American context today will probably not be seen as a disciplinarian. He will probably be seen as an abusive father, so to say, because my father doesn't talk very, very much. He does most of the thing with a cane or by hitting you. But I always say, now that I'm a father and I'm a grown up myself, I tend to appreciate what he did for me, and especially living in this society today. What kind of father can you say your dad was, and how did mom cope with him? And how many of you say you have an elder brother that was 7 years older than you? Did you have a
Yeah.
sister, or it were just two boys that both parents raised?
It was just the two of us, and the kind of father that I have. And I'm very thankful that I still have both my parents around. They're both still alive and kicking, thankfully. But growing up, my father, I realized, was a person who was in a difficult situation because he grew up without a father. He grew up with just his mother, with other family members around, but his father was not a present force in his life. And I've come to know and reflect back on that as I've talked to him a little bit more and more as I've gotten older and become a dad about what his experience were, and it's actually quite heartbreaking. But growing up, there were times that I didn't understand why he was angry, or there were times I didn't understand why he was silent. But that was just part of what he had gone through. And what I truly appreciate is that he did not have a father, but he chose to break that cycle, to remain with his family through thick and thin, and to be that presence. Because there's nothing like a parent who is there for you. They don't always have to say the right thing, they don't always have to do the right thing, but when they're there and you know that they're there, it makes a real difference. So growing up, I had to learn a lot about what it means to be a son, and also learn a lot about what it means to have a father. And as I become a dad, my eyes have really been opened over time.
That's very interesting. Of course, you also mentioned that you are a father of two teenage boys in
Yep.
America today. Tell me
Yep.
how that is, how that has been for you since when they were uh, born, and I'm sure you might not be able to tell the difference between a male and a female child. But I have just a son and I have four daughters, and I can tell the huge difference between them. But I want to understand the perspective of raising two boys as well. How has that adventure been for you, sir?
Well, it was really hard for us because we had them close together. They're only 23 months apart. So they usually kind of psychologists will recommend maybe about a 3 year gap is what they usually will say. But ours were 23 months apart. And the hardest thing was that they always wanted to occupy the same space. They wanted to sit in the same seat. They wanted the attention from the parent at the same time. They always wanted to be at the same stage. And now they've really differentiated. My older son plays football. I love to go to his practices and his games and be present for that. The younger one is a little bit more quiet. He's more artistic. He's interested in engineering and crafting things with his hands. So supporting him has been different than supporting my older son. But really, the thing that I've really come to see in the last year, that when both of them have really been living as teenagers in my home, is that less is more. It's not just about that I am on top of them all the time, because you can't do that to teenagers. They need their space. They need to differentiate from their parents. They need to have that time to think and just be themselves. But the time that you do spend with them is quality time. So I'll go on bike rides with one son, and I will watch a football game with the other. I will take one for dinner and then another one on another day for lunch. And I listen. I try to listen as much as I can to what they're experiencing, and I try not to judge. I just try to listen because they're the ones who have to figure this out. I'm not the one playing the game of football. I'm not the one trying to create a piece of art. I'm the one trying to just let them know that I'm here. You want a shoulder to cry on, or somebody to test an idea out on, or just to listen, and that's what I'm here for.
Wow, that's that's a 21st century fatherhood you just described there, and I am kind of stunned, might not be the word, that you've been able to have control of these two young men that you said you have, and it's going to be like the crop of our discussion today, because I'm going to use that as an example, as a contrast of what I think is going on in society today. Uh, based on your position as a spiritual leader, and of course
Yeah.
as a father in your own home of two boys, what do you think is the challenge in the world today? Because as I always say, especially in my about 2 episodes ago of the show, was about the gun violence that we have that is so
Yeah.
prevalent in our society today. And not just that, I don't watch a lot of TV. I watch about 30 minutes of news every day, but I pay attention a lot. And also for the fact that I work in the criminal justice system, that when you watch TV, most of the crimes that are committed these days are committed by young teenagers, 15, 16,
Yeah.
17. What
Younger.
do you
Younger.
think is wrong?
You know, we have seen, at least I've seen in my family with my two boys, and my brother has a son and a daughter. He got the daughter. You know, we rolled the dice. He got the daughter. But what I notice is that the same problem that we're experiencing today has been experienced over time. And you mentioned a very specific word, which is control. And I want to say, I don't think parenting is about control. I think parenting is about relationship and accountability. And so one of the things I have done with my children is we've talked about expectations. What do we expect of you? Not just that, but who is our family? How does our family behave and what do we value? You know, so the choices that we make in the way that our family behaves lets people know what we value. You know, so we go to church not just because I'm the pastor or the priest there. We go to church because it's a family value that we have. My son, when we get in the car every day, the older one, I take him to high school. He started to say maybe about 6 months ago, I want us to pray before we put the car in reverse. And that really floored me because what it tells me is that he has a value that is important to him. And so I've got to foster that. So when we see families who are struggling, it's a breakdown in the relationships. I think a lot of parents are struggling with their own issues. I remember my dad being extremely tired. He worked nights, you know, so I could go 6 days without seeing him. And he would make the sacrifice to say, you know what? I have not seen this boy in 4 or 5 days. I'm going to wake up early after having gone through the night shift and I'm going to take him to school because I want to know what's going on in his head. You know, my mother, we had a rule when she drove me to school and when she picked me up from school almost every day. The rule was you had to talk. You had to have some kind of conversation that was meaningful. You had to talk with one another, talk about the day, what was interesting, what did you learn? And that's really what it's about. You know, if I want to encourage parents today, I would tell them, first of all, look inside yourself. What are the issues that you're facing? Because we all have some brokenness that we're dealing with. Realize that the most important thing that you can do for your children is your time. And that can be very hard, but time is the most important thing.
Time is the most important thing, and I appreciate you for using a different word earlier from what when I said how did you manage to control those two teenage boys that you have, by saying the word might not be control, but the word will be should be expectation. But
Yeah.
these days, as I mentioned earlier, you tend to see most of these guys, for example, over the last few years in the prison, most of the young the inmates that are coming in that I see these days are in their 16,
Yeah.
17, 18, very very early years of their life where they should be productive. And I always wonder, a few of them that I've had conversation with, what where is your dad? Most of them always look very lost.
Yeah.
And what they say is, I mean, some of them say, I don't fool with that man, using their words right
Right.
now, or I
Yeah.
don't know where he's at, or I never met him. What do you think is result? What do you think caused this very deep uh difference and space between the male child and their fathers, especially in America today?
That's a very big sociological question. One of the things that there's a Pew Research study that talked about, it was done in 2019, and I haven't seen that it's been updated quite yet, but it talks about of 130 countries, the US has 24%, like a quarter of families that under the age of 18 that there's not a mom and a dad. And a lot of it's fatherlessness. Um, I think one of the things that we've seen is the disintegration of the family in our society. We've seen it to where drug abuse, alcoholism, we've seen a lot of different things creep into the family. And when we see moms and dads who are struggling and cannot remain together, or maybe should not remain together because sometimes it's not a very healthy situation, the children are the ones that suffer. From what I have seen spiritually, because I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, but what I've seen spiritually is there's a lot of hopelessness out there. And going back to specifically the 15 and the 16-year-old men, because they're basically men at this point, in what society has pushed them into. If you were to take them and give them purpose, you would see a transformation. You really would. One of the things that happens with people that I meet or young men that I work with who don't have a good relationship with their father, they feel orphaned. You don't know your past. You don't know your history. And that's one of the benefits that I have. I have a history, I have a lineage, an ancestry that I can go to and have roots. And there are people who don't feel that. And so the question is going to become, how do we break this cycle? Because now you have this 16-year-old man, right, young man, who he's going to go out there and start a family, and probably maybe not in the best way. And it's going to perpetuate this brokenness. And at some point, someone is going to have to stop and say to themselves, it stops here. And that's really hard. If you haven't been given the tools, if you haven't been taught how, if you haven't been supported in your life, breaking that cycle is nearly impossible.
You know what makes it this even much more interesting? I read a book very recently by Tony Evans, Pastor Tony Evans.
Yeah.
It was titled "The Kingdom Man." I think it was the second book I read this year, and one of the biggest takeaway for me in that book was you've used that word a few times, and it gives me a very strong reminder. It gives me some kind of hope and expectation that some of us just have to like take that as an assignment, someone that is willing to break the cycle. Pastor Tony Evans said in that book that his father chose to stay with the mom, even though at the early stage of the marriage, she didn't understand what was going on, what the man was doing when the man would be reading Bible, fighting her and dragging stuff with her, dragging stuff with him. The man would still, at the end of the day, pick up his Bible, and that was what defined their family and gave that family the foundation it has today. Also, you said something that personally is my own mantra, which is purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in your capacity as a leader in your organization and as a leader in the community and in your state, is there something that you are doing in your own little way to see how you can start making this change? And how have you been able to execute that thing you're doing? And how successful have you been so far? Share with us, please.
Well, in the ministry that I have here, one of the things that I have been really doing, and we have an older population because this is the state of Florida, so we have a lot of retirees, a lot of people who come to retire here. And so what we've been doing is kind of climbing down the ladder. We've been working with people who are older, and then their children, and then their children, and so on. But one of the things I've tried to do is to create a sense of relationship within the congregation. And what that means is we try to get people to know each other. And we try to get people to do things together. I'm teaching a class right now for two young ladies who are getting ready to do their first communion in the church. And I've basically likened it to, what are the things that a family does, right? They have a mom and a dad, they've got a strong family. And I'm building on that and saying the church is a family. And so what are the things that the church does that reminds you of a family? Well, we get together, we eat food, we pray for one another, We have fun together. These are all things that a family does or should be doing. And it's starting to sink in that this can be another family for them. And so that's really one of the things I try to tell people is that if you cannot have a family in what you want right now, if you're out there all alone and you don't have a mom or you don't have a dad or you just feel all alone, find a sense of community, find healthy community. And in that community, you're going to find that fellowship and that purpose. One of the things long term that I'd like to do is actually one of the things that we're doing right now, which is I'm trying to start a podcast for men's issues because I have kind of had it up to here with some of the men's podcasts that I've seen that are just so toxic. They humiliate women. They talk about these values for men that are only about making money and getting rich and just using people left and right. And that's what makes you a big man. And I'm tired of that. And so that's kind of one of my plans long term is to create a podcast or some type of environment where we can discuss those issues from a perspective that has some accountability, that has some equality, and it has some spirituality behind it as well, even though you don't necessarily have to be a believer to participate in the project.
Excellent, sir. Excellent. You also mentioned something early about the issue of foundation.
Mm-hmm.
It's very powerful that you mentioned that. And as I said to one of my last guest on the show, that America before I came here was a big dream.
Yeah.
To come to America because one of the things that attracted many migrants, which I'm one of, is
Yeah.
that this country mentioned a lot about God, and actually the motto is "In God We Trust." But
Mm-hmm.
over the last few years, when you look at our working environment, it does not look like an environment that encourages family bondness and how family can stay together, which I know you've mentioned. How do you think we as a people, which is one of, like you said, one of the things we are doing, to start talking about things that will remind many of these young couple or older couple that are not getting it right at this time to look beyond themselves first and to look at the bigger picture. If there are issues, to go back to the foundation and say, okay, where did we get it wrong? What other
Yeah.
ways? I know you already mentioned one, and I'm very thankful for what you're doing and for what you aim to do, because we can always wait to just keep talking up, to keep
No.
not liking what people are doing when we ourselves are not doing anything about it. But how do you think we can start taking this message beyond just talking about it here and actually reaching out to those people that need it at the core of the
Yeah.
country itself?
I think one of the biggest things, and you talk about a foundation, I think one of the hardest things to do is to tell somebody, have you examined yourself? Each day I think that we're called as Christians, I think even just as human beings, we're called to reflect on the day and ask, what did I do? For me, the examination that I do each evening is, did I live in the way God has called me to live? Did I love people in the way that I was called to love them? And if I didn't, what am I going to do about that? First of all, I've got to confess that, but then I've got to make amends for that. And what I would say is the first foundation that people need to do is to look in themselves and realize you cannot be your own foundation. You cannot base your life on just yourself. You're going to crumble, you're going to fall apart. It just does not work that way. The analogy that I make is, there is a throne, right? And I don't want to sit on it because I'm not qualified. I can make decisions for my life. I have a will to make decisions for my life, but I'm not the one who's only in charge. And so helping people to see that, but then also not judging them. I think people feel very judged when we begin to ask them to be accountable and to reflect on their lives, because they say, listen, we've made mistakes and I don't know how to come back from this.
Hmm.
If you are a young person today and you have begun to live in the way the world has taught you to live, and you have ended up, maybe having a child before you were ready, or having a marriage that did not work out, you feel hurt. And so it's not my place or anybody else's place to sit here and pass judgment on you. But it
Hmm.
is to say, if you've done something that you need to kind of look back and say, how do I grow from this? And how do I not repeat it? There are a lot of people repeating a lot of the same behaviors that they shouldn't be.
Wow. Thank you so much, sir. I said it at the beginning of the show that even before we start recording, that most likely our episode will run into 2 episodes, and I'm not surprised at all because I know there is still many areas that we need to touch. I was still going to ask you, what do you think about the criminal justice system in the United States itself? But I will have to hold on that question,
Yeah.
as well as how you think we can keep encouraging our young men, especially in high school. Because, for example, one of the things that I have done, beyond being a correctional officer, I always tell people I'm more than just a correctional officer. I believe I'm a change agent. I believe God has called me for a purpose to come here and to see how much I can help other young men. My story, I always say it should be able to inspire anyone. I'm from
Right.
a first child that of from a polygamous family, and I have every excuse to not want to make it or to not be where I am today. But I have succumbed many. I have surpassed many challenges and I am here today. But again, like I said, we're going to put that to our next episode. But I'm going to ask you these questions that I always ask, and I know you will
Yep.
find I will find more for you in our next episode. And the first one is about leadership, which, as I said in the opening of the show,
Hmm.
one of the biggest challenges in America today is lack of accountability from our leaders. And at this level, if you are carrying a mantle of leadership, people have the right to question you, maybe not to judge, but people have the right to ask you
Yeah.
questions. So I'm going to ask you, do you think, sir, that leaders are born or they are made?
I think my answer would be yes, and I'll tell you why. So when I say that leaders are born, I think there are some people who are born with leadership skills. These are these gifts that some people have, that they're charismatic, they have an amazing personality, or they have a great mind that's very analytical, or they're very compassionate. But I've also seen examples, especially in the Bible, where God picks somebody who you would never imagine would be a leader and says, "You're going to be a leader."
Hmm,
And so when I think of myself as a leader, I recognize that there's some gifts that God gave me,
hmm.
but I was formed by the people around me. I was formed by my education. I was formed by the church. I was formed by my family to be the person that I am today. And so, yes, you can be born with amazing gifts, but if you're never formed, you will never be a leader.
Fantastic response. No surprise at all. I think my next question for you will be about men. You already said your dad did an amazing job by breaking the cycle, which is what a lot of people don't talk about. Now, for him to have that grace to break that cycle, what would you say makes a good man? What are the characteristics that the man must have, and what would you, as in your own role and with all your life experience, would say makes a good man?
I would say that a good man is made up of several things. A good man doesn't necessarily have to be a person who is a believer. I think that makes you a holy man. And I think that the true path of being a truly good man, does take you eventually down that road of being a person who believes. But also, I would say that a good man is a person who does good. It's a man who is willing to show up and do the things that are hard. You know, Being a parent is hard because you don't get to do the things that you want to do. You have to do the things that you have to do. And you don't always want to show up. You don't always want to make the sacrifice, but you do. That's what it means to be the parent. And so when I think of being a good dad or being a good man, It is a person who's willing to show up and do what has to be done that is good and helps others to do good.
Wow, that's a very, very good answer. I'm not going to keep my two questions. I'm going to make sure I exhaust my questions on this episode. And then when we come back for our second episode to continue this very interesting conversation, I will definitely create more questions for you. The other question will be, yeah, as also a spiritual leader in your role, what is the favorite quote that you live by? One of the ones I live by was the one mentioned by Mr. Leslie Brown is a great motivational speaker, and somebody I've learned a lot from is the father I never had, as I call him, and he said, courage is going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. That particular one always talked by me, and I'm always like, okay, I have to have courage and to keep going even if I fail. What is your own favorite quote? One of them. I'm sure you're going to have many that you live by.
Well, I have a couple, but I think the one that really speaks to me is there's a very particular saint who I have a very special devotion to. His name is St. Francis of Assisi. You probably know him because of all the blessings of pets and things like that. But he was a person who lived in a time where it was very easy to be like a playboy, kind of like now. And that's kind of who he was. He was a spoiled rich kid, and he gave it all up to serve the poor. And one of the things that he said that I always come back to is a single sunbeam is enough to drive away many shadows. And to me, what that means is it doesn't always mean that I'm going to be very bright or that I'm always going to shine in the way that I want to. But the light that comes from me, that's been put inside of me, is enough to cast away some shadows in other people and in the world. And I'm just called to shine.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Father Alex, for coming on the show. And as I promised, if you're listening, be sure that this conversation continues. But today, it's been my pleasure having you on the show. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your wisdom, your life lessons, your family story, to be able to inspire others out there. And I want to say thank you very much. Well, that has been the episode of the podcast today. I've been so blessed, learning some new perspective, hearing that leadership quote that he lived by, and many other interesting, especially about the two young men that he's raising. That's a lot of work today in the America that I know. So thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Till I see you guys again next week, God willing. My name is Bayonle Arashi. It's been my pleasure bringing the show to you. Keep chasing your dream, find a purpose for your life, and your life will never be the same. Have an awesome day. Bye-bye now.
Thank you for listening to the Crossing Bridges podcast with Bayonle Arashi. Your comments, suggestions, and ideas are welcomed. Follow Bayonle on all social media platforms at Bayonle Arashi, or visit www.bayonlearashi.com for coaching and speaking engagements. See you next time.